The road was barely wide enough for Alex's SUV, its gravel crunching under the tires as the vehicle climbed higher into the wilderness. The forest on either side seemed endless, the trees standing like sentinels with their gnarled branches forming a canopy that filtered the fading sunlight. Each turn revealed more of the same: pine, moss, and shadow. The only relief from the monotony was the occasional clearing where the mountain views stretched out like a painted landscape, distant peaks fading into mist. Inside the SUV, the mood was a mixture of cautious optimism and quiet irritation. Lisa was sprawled in the back seat, her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on the dense forest beyond the window. "Are we even sure this road leads somewhere?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Of course," Alex replied from behind the wheel, though his confidence faltered slightly. He tapped at the dashboard where the GPS had frozen hours ago, displaying a blinking signal icon. "This is exactly where we're supposed to be. Just trust me." "That's the problem," Lisa muttered under her breath, earning a smirk from Sarah, who sat beside her. Up front, Ryan leaned forward in his seat, squinting through the windshield. "This is a great start to a horror movie," he quipped. "Remote cabin, no cell service, and 6 clueless city kids. What could go wrong?" "Relax," Alex said, shaking his head. "This isn't some cheap slasher flick. We'll be fine. No mas maniacs y promija." The tension eased slightly as laughter filled the car, but it wasn't enough to completely dispel the unease that had settled over the group. They had all agreed to this trip willingly, yet now, as they ventured deeper into the mountains, it was hard not to second-guess the decision. The cabin came into view just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was nestled at the edge of a wide clearing, its silhouette stark against the fading light. The structure was older than any of them had expected. 2 stories of weathered cedar and peeling paint, with a sloping roof that sagged in the middle. The front porch was littered with fallen leaves, and one of the shutters hung loose, creaking softly in the evening breeze. "Wow," Ryan said as Alex pulled the SUV to a stop. "It's quaint." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "It's falling apart." "Rustic," Alex corrected, opening the driver's door and stepping out. The crisp mountain air hit him immediately, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. He stretched, taking a deep breath. This is exactly what we needed. No distractions, no schedules, just us in the mountains. Ben, who had been quiet for most of the drive, finally spoke up. "I don't mind it. Feels like we're off the grid, you know? No one to bother us." "Except for bears," Sarah added, her tone light, but her expression less so. The group began unloading the car, their laughter fading as they carried bags and supplies up the creaking porch steps. The front door opened with a reluctant groan, revealing an interior that matched the cabin's weathered exterior. The main room was spacious but sparsely furnished, dominated by a stone fireplace on one wall. A few mismatched chairs surrounded a rickety wooden table, and a faded rug covered part of the floor. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by their movements. "Well," Lisa said, setting down her bag and surveying the space, "at least it has a roof." "And a fireplace," Sarah added, moving to inspect it. She crouched down, running her fingers over the hearth's cold stones. "If we can get this going, it won't be so bad." Upstairs, Alex and Ryan found 2 small bedrooms, each with a pair of bunk beds. The mattresses were thin and covered in floral prints that had faded to near gray over the years. A third room held only an empty bookshelf and a single chair. "We'll have to draw straws for the good beds," Ryan joked, testing the springs on one of the bunks. It squeaked loudly under his weight. Downstairs, Emma was unpacking groceries in the tiny kitchen, which boasted a rust-stained sink and an old gas stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. She opened a cabinet and frowned at its contents. Several jars of unidentifiable preserves and a layer of dust thick enough to write her name in. "This is going to take some work," she called out to no one in particular. By the time the sun had fully set, the group had managed to make the cabin somewhat livable. The fire roared in the hearth, casting warm orange light across the room. Ben had found an old oil lamp in one of the closets, and its dim glow added to the rustic charm. The 6 of them sat around the table, beers in hand, the tension of the drive replaced by easy conversation. "So," Alex began, raising his bottle, "here's to old friends and new adventures. Let's make this weekend one to remember." The others raised their drinks in agreement, their smiles genuine for the first time all day. The evening passed in a haze of laughter and nostalgia. They played cards, told stories, and shared updates on their lives. The cabin, for all its flaws, began to feel like a sanctuary. The isolation that had unnerved them earlier now seemed like a blessing, a chance to reconnect without the distractions of the outside world. It wasn't until much later, when the fire had burned low and the room had grown quiet, that Ben stood up from his chair. "I think I'll take a walk," he said, grabbing his jacket from the back of a chair. Lisa looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "Now? It's freezing out there." "I'll stick close," Ben replied. "Just want to get some fresh air before bed." "Suit yourself," Alex said with a shrug, already half asleep where he sat. No one else said anything as Ben slipped out the door, letting it close softly behind him. The sound of his footsteps on the porch faded quickly, swallowed by the forest. Minutes passed, then an hour. The others had drifted off to their respective rooms, the cabin falling into silence except for the occasional pop of the dying fire. Outside, the woods were dark and still, the trees swaying gently in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, a low, mournful sound that echoed briefly before fading away. And Ben didn't come back. The morning broke sluggishly, the weak sunlight barely penetrating the dense canopy of trees surrounding the cabin. A thin mist clung to the ground, curling around the trunks and seeping into the cracks of the cabin walls like a persistent intruder. Lisa was the first to notice something was wrong. She had woken early, shivering despite the fire's embers that still glowed faintly in the hearth. Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, she wandered into the main room and froze when she saw the door ajar. A gust of cold air pushed its way inside, scattering ashes from the fireplace and carrying with it the sharp, earthy scent of the forest. Lisa frowned, her pulse quickening. "Ben," she called softly, stepping toward the door. Her voice echoed in the silence. No response. The others emerged gradually, one by one, their groggy faces marked by varying degrees of irritation and concern. Ryan stretched, his hair sticking up in every direction, while Sarah rubbed her eyes and mumbled, "What's going on?" "Ben's not here," Lisa said, pointing to the open door. "I think he left it like this last night. He never came back." Alex, now fully awake, grabbed his coat from the back of a chair. "Maybe he went out for a walk. He probably lost track of time." "At sunrise?" Emma asked, her tone skeptical. "In the cold?" Alex shrugged, though his jaw was tight. "He'll show up. Let's just check around the clearing." The group split up, fanning out across the small area surrounding the cabin. The clearing was bordered by thick underbrush, the kind that seemed to reach out and grab at clothing and skin. Each of them called Ben's name, their voices carrying into the forest before fading into the heavy stillness. Lisa circled the cabin twice, her boots crunching on frost-covered leaves. The air was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of branches in the breeze. She felt the weight of the silence pressing against her ears, amplifying her own breathing. "Ben," she called again, louder this time. Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the woods. When they regrouped, the tension was palpable. Alex's face was set in a grim line as he addressed the others. "Let's not panic," he said, though his voice was strained. "We'll check the trail next." Maybe he followed it and got turned around. "Without telling anyone?" Sarah interjected. "That doesn't make sense." "He's not stupid, Alex." Ryan paced back and forth, his hands jammed into his jacket pockets. "If he's lost, we're wasting time just standing here. Let's move." Alex nodded, and the group set off toward the trailhead. It was a narrow path, barely discernible beneath layers of fallen leaves and pine needles. The mist had begun to lift, but the forest remained shadowed, the thick canopy allowing only fractured beams of sunlight to pierce through. Hours passed as they searched. They followed the trail in both directions, calling Ben's name until their voices grew hoarse. The only response was the occasional rustle of wildlife or the whisper of the wind. By midday, their initial optimism had turned to dread. Lisa was the first to suggest what everyone else was thinking. "What if something happened to him?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Emma shot her a sharp look. "Don't say that. He's fine. We just need to keep looking." "But what if he's not?" Lisa persisted, her eyes locking onto Alex's. "We need to go back to the trailhead and get help. There has to be a ranger station nearby." Alex hesitated, glancing at the sky. The sun was already beginning its descent, the shadows growing longer with each passing minute. "We don't have enough daylight to make it there and back," he said finally. "We'll try again in the morning if we don't find him by tonight." "By tonight?" Lisa repeated, her voice rising. "You want to wait until then?" Ryan stepped between them, his tone placating. "She's right, Alex. If we don't find him soon, we need to call someone." Alex opened his mouth to argue, but before he could respond, Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "Wait, over here!" They turned to see her standing near a dense patch of undergrowth, her hand clutching something small and bright. As they approached, she held it up for them to see, a torn piece of red fabric. "It's from his jacket," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I'm sure of it." The group stared at the fabric, the realization sinking in like a stone in water. They returned to the cabin in silence, the mood heavier than before. Sarah placed the scrap of fabric on the table, smoothing it out with shaking hands. "This doesn't make sense," Emma said, breaking the silence. "If he got caught on something, why didn't he call for help?" "Maybe he couldn't," Lisa replied darkly. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. "We're wasting time. We should have gone for help hours ago. And what if we leave and he comes back while we're gone?" Alex countered. "Enough!" Lisa snapped, slamming her hand on the table. "Arguing isn't helping anyone. We need a plan." But no one had any answers. As night fell, the atmosphere in the cabin grew suffocating. The fire in the hearth did little to warm the space, and every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, set their nerves on edge. Ryan, unable to sit still, volunteered to keep watch. He sat by the front door, a lantern on the table beside him, and a hunting knife clutched tightly in his hand. The others tried to sleep, but the tension was too thick, their minds racing with worst-case scenarios. Around midnight, Ryan thought he heard something, a faint, rhythmic rustling, as though someone were moving through the underbrush outside. He froze, straining his ears. Then he called softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The sound stopped. Moments later, Alex appeared, drawn by the commotion. "What is it?" Ryan gestured toward the window, his eyes wide. "I heard something. Out there." Alex peered into the darkness, but the forest beyond was an impenetrable wall of shadows. "Probably an animal," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Ryan didn't respond. He tightened his grip on the knife, his heart pounding in his chest. Somewhere out there, something was watching. He was sure of it. By the time dawn broke, the forest was veiled in a cold mist that hung low to the ground, curling around tree trunks like ghostly fingers. Inside the cabin, the group had barely slept. The night had been restless, filled with the groans of the old structure and the creaks of shifting floorboards. Every sound had seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Alex had insisted on taking over Ryan's watch in the early hours, but nothing had happened. No more rustling, no figures in the shadows, and, most importantly, no sign of Ben. As the group gathered in the main room, bleary-eyed and tense, it was clear they were all teetering on the edge. Lisa sat on the couch, clutching a mug of lukewarm coffee, while Sarah paced near the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "We can't keep waiting," Ryan said, his voice breaking the silence. He leaned against the table, his knuckles white as he gripped its edge. "We have to go to the trailhead. Now!" "And leave Ben?" Emma asked sharply. Lisa slammed her mug down. "Ben isn't here, Emma. We don't even know if he's still." She stopped herself, biting her lip hard enough to draw blood. "No," Sarah said firmly. "Don't even say that. He's alive. He has to be." Alex raised his hands, trying to maintain order. "We'll split up again, cover more ground. This time, we go farther. Take anything that looks like a clue and mark where we've been." "What if it's not safe?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have a choice," Alex replied. His tone was resolute, but his eyes betrayed his own doubt. The group set out an hour later, armed with flashlights, whistles, and whatever tools they could scrounge up. Alex and Lisa took one direction, while Ryan, Emma, and Sarah ventured another. The forest seemed darker than it should have been, even with the sun now fully risen. The towering pines and their thick canopy blocked most of the light, leaving the forest floor in perpetual gloom. Lisa followed close behind Alex, her flashlight beam sweeping across the ground. She hated the silence, the way the trees muffled every sound and made her footsteps seem louder than they were. "This is insane," she muttered. "We don't even know what we're looking for." "Anything," Alex replied curtly. The pair trudged forward for what felt like hours, the underbrush clawing at their clothes and slowing their progress. Then, just as Lisa was about to demand they turn back, Alex stopped abruptly. "What is it?" Lisa asked, stepping closer. Alex knelt down and picked up something tangled in the bushes. It was another scrap of fabric, this one larger than the first. The color and texture were unmistakable. It was from Ben's jacket. Lisa's stomach dropped. "That's not a good sign, is it? Maybe he got caught on something," Alex said, though he didn't sound convinced. He stuffed the fabric into his pocket. "Let's keep going." Meanwhile, on the other side of the woods, Ryan's group had stumbled upon something even stranger. The trail they were following abruptly ended in a small clearing. In the center of the space was a large, overturned tree, its roots clawing upward like skeletal fingers. "What's that?" Emma asked, pointing to a faint glint of metal near the roots. Ryan approached cautiously, crouching down to examine the object. It was a pocket knife, worn and slightly rusted, but familiar. "This is Ben's," Ryan said, holding it up. Sarah knelt beside him, her face pale. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Ryan replied. "I gave it to him years ago." Emma looked around, her voice trembling. "So where is he? Why would he drop this here?" Ryan stood, his jaw tightening. "We need to keep moving. There's no way he's far from here." But as they pressed on, an uneasy feeling settled over them. The forest seemed to grow darker, the air heavier. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made them jump, and Sarah swore she saw movement in the shadows more than once. When the groups reconvened at the cabin later that afternoon, the mood was grim. Alex placed the scrap of fabric on the table beside the pocket knife, his expression unreadable. "This is bad," Lisa said, breaking the silence. She gestured to the items. "This isn't just someone getting lost. Something happened to him." Emma bristled. "You don't know that. He could still be out there." Lisa's voice rose. "Open your eyes, Emma. It's been almost 24 hours. If he could come back, he would have by now." "Stop it," Sarah snapped, tears streaming down her face. "Just stop." The room fell into a tense silence. Ryan finally spoke, his voice low and even. "We need to go to the trailhead. Tonight. And what if whoever or whatever is out there follows us?" Alex asked. "We can't just sit here." Ryan shot back. The argument dragged on for hours, but in the end, no one could agree on a plan. That night, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Ryan sat near the window, his hunting knife on the table beside him. Alex had taken the couch, pretending to sleep, while Lisa sat silently on the floor, her knees drawn to her chest. The forest beyond the windows was pitch black, and every sound seemed amplified. The wind against the glass, the distant creak of the trees, the faint scurrying of animals. And then, just past midnight, they heard it. A voice. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. "Help!" Ryan was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the lantern and rushing to the door. "Wait!" Alex hissed, scrambling to stop him. "It could be a trap." Ryan hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The voice came again, closer this time. "Help me! It's Ben," Ryan whispered. Lisa stood, her heart pounding. "It could be anything. We don't know." "I'm not leaving him out there," Ryan said firmly, opening the door before anyone could stop him. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the faint sound of the voice with it. Alex grabbed his flashlight, We can't let him go alone. Reluctantly, the group followed Ryan into the darkness, the voice guiding them deeper into the woods. But the farther they went, the clearer it became that something wasn't right. The voice didn't grow louder as they approached. It stayed the same, an eerie, monotone loop that sent chills down their spines. "Help me!" They stopped abruptly when Ryan's flashlight illuminated the source of the sound. It wasn't Ben. It was a small speaker, partially buried in the dirt, playing the recorded plea on repeat. Ryan's hand tightened around the knife as a sinking realization dawned on them all. They weren't alone. The realization struck them all at once, like a collective blow to the chest. The speaker's repetitive plea, Ben's voice, distorted and robotic, echoed in the tense silence. Ryan crouched beside the device, his face contorted with a mixture of confusion and fury as he reached out and silenced it. The woods around them seemed to exhale, the absence of the sound making the darkness feel even heavier. Who the hell would do this? Ryan growled, his knuckles white as he clenched the hunting knife. Lisa took a shaky step back, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "This isn't random. Someone is messing with us." Sarah, standing frozen behind Alex, let out a small whimper. This means they were watching us. They knew we'd come out here. Alex scanned the surrounding trees, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically. The forest was an impenetrable wall of shadows, every shifting branch or rustling leaf magnified by their rising panic. "We need to get back to the cabin. Now!" "No!" Ryan snapped, his voice sharp. "Whoever did this is out here. What if Ben's with them?" "We don't know that." Alex shot back. "And if we stay out here, we're sitting ducks." "He's right," Lisa interjected, her voice unsteady but firm. "We can't fight someone we can't see. We need to regroup." Ryan hesitated, his body tense as though he might bolt into the woods on his own. Finally, with a frustrated growl, he relented. "Fine, but we're not waiting until morning to figure this out." The walk back to the cabin was agonizingly slow. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Lisa kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced they were being followed. But each time she turned, there was nothing but the dark expanse of the woods. When they finally reached the cabin, Alex bolted the door behind them, the sound of the lock clicking into place oddly comforting. Ryan dropped into a chair by the table, running a hand through his hair. Sarah slumped onto the couch, tears streaming silently down her face. "We need to think," Alex said, pacing near the fireplace. "Whoever did this, they're playing games. They want us scared." "Mission accomplished," Lisa muttered bitterly, dropping her flashlight onto the table. "Why would they use Ben's voice?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. That means they've seen him." Or, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Don't," Sarah whispered, wiping her eyes. "Don't say it. We can't rule anything out," Alex said, though his voice was heavy with reluctance. "It's been over a day. If someone has him, we're running out of time. Then we fight," Ryan said abruptly, standing up. "I'm not waiting for them to come to us." "And how do you suggest we do that?" Lisa snapped. "What? Are we going to hunt them down with sticks and flashlights?" Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The hours dragged on, the cabin suffocating under the weight of their collective fear. Alex kept watch by the window, his eyes scanning the clearing outside for any sign of movement. Lisa sat near the fire, poking at the embers with a metal rod, while Sarah and Emma huddled together on the couch. Ryan, unable to sit still, paced near the door, his knife glinting in the dim light. "Do you hear that?" he asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. Alex frowned. "Hear what?" Ryan gestured toward the window. "Out there. It's too quiet." Lisa scoffed. "Too quiet? You're reaching." "No," Ryan insisted, his voice lowering. "Think about it. No birds, no wind, nothing. It's like the whole forest is holding its breath." The group fell silent, straining to hear anything beyond the walls of the cabin. Ryan was right. The usual symphony of nocturnal creatures was absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Then, from somewhere in the woods, came the sound of snapping branches. Lisa froze, her hand gripping the metal rod. "Did you hear that?" Alex nodded, his face pale. Stay quiet. The sound came again, closer this time. A deliberate, heavy crunching of footsteps moving through the underbrush. They're coming, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex motioned for everyone to move away from the windows. Ryan stood by the door, his knuckles tied around the knife handle, while Lisa grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, a cast-iron skillet from the kitchen. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. The only sound was the faint crackle of the dying fire and the hammering of their own hearts. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the cabin door. The group collectively flinched, their eyes darting to the door as though it might burst open at any second. "Don't answer it," Lisa hissed, her grip tightening on the skillet. "Who is it?" Ryan shouted, his voice breaking slightly. No response. The knocking came again, louder this time. "Go away," Alex yelled, his voice cracking under the strain. Still, there was no answer. The group held their breath, their eyes locked on the door. Then, after a few agonizing moments, the footsteps began again, retreating into the woods. Ryan moved to the window cautiously, peering through a crack in the curtains. The clearing was empty, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the edge of the firelight. "They're gone," he said, though his tone was uncertain. "For now," Lisa muttered. No one slept that night. They sat in shifts, keeping the fire stoked and their eyes on the windows. Each of them jumped at the slightest sound, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. By dawn, the group was exhausted but alive, their determination hardened by the ordeal. "This can't go on," Alex said as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. "We need to make a move." "To where?" Lisa asked, her voice hollow. "The trailhead is miles away, and we don't even know if we'd make it." "We don't have a choice," Alex replied firmly. "We can't stay here and wait for them to pick us off." Ryan stood, his knife still in hand. "Then we fight back. If they're hunting us, we make them regret it." The group exchanged uncertain glances, their fear tempered by a growing resolve. Whoever was out there, watching them, wouldn't stop until they were dead. It was time to fight for survival. The cabin, once their sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The morning sun hung low in the sky. Its light filtered through the dense forest canopy, creating shifting patterns of shadow and light that only deepened the group's unease. They gathered in the main room, their faces pale and drawn from exhaustion and fear. Alex stood at the head of the table, the de facto leader of their dwindling confidence. "We can't stay here. Whoever's out there has the upper hand. They know the woods better than we do, and they're not afraid to mess with us." Lisa crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. "So what's the plan? Run blindly into the forest and hope we don't get picked off?" "No," Alex said firmly. "We stick together, follow the trail to the ranger station, and call for help. It's our best shot." "What if it's a trap?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "They could be waiting for us. They're already toying with us," Ryan interjected, his knife resting on the table in front of him. "If we stay, we're sitting ducks. Out there, at least we can move. Fight back if we have to." Lisa glanced at Sarah and Emma, their fear mirrored in her own eyes. "We don't even know who or what we're up against." "We'll find out soon enough," Alex said, stuffing supplies into a backpack. "We leave in 10 minutes. They moved cautiously, every step calculated, every sound scrutinized. The trail leading away from the cabin was narrow and uneven, winding through thick underbrush and over fallen logs. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing together like an impenetrable wall. Even in daylight, the woods felt dark, the canopy blocking most of the sun's warmth. Alex led the way, with Ryan close behind. Lisa stayed near the middle of the group, her makeshift weapon, a heavy iron skillet, clutched tightly in her hands. Emma and Sarah brought up the rear, their eyes darting nervously at every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. For a time, the only sound was the crunch of their boots on the forest floor and the occasional bird call. But as they ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, the silence oppressive. It felt as though the forest itself was watching them, holding its breath. The first sign of trouble came about an hour into their journey. They reached a fork in the trail, the path splitting into two equally overgrown directions. Alex hesitated, pulling a faded map from his pocket. He unfolded it, his brow furrowed as he scanned the lines and markings. "This isn't on the map," he muttered. Lisa leaned over his shoulder. "Great, so now we're officially lost." "We're not lost," Alex snapped, though his tone lacked conviction. "We just need to choose the right path." "Flip a coin," Ryan suggested dryly, earning a glare from Lisa. As they argued, Sarah's eyes drifted to the trees. Something glinted in the sunlight, a flash of metal, almost imperceptible. She stepped closer, her breath catching when she saw what it was. "Guys," she said, her voice shaky. "Look." The group turned to see what she had found. A crude snare, its wires stretched taut between two trees. The noose set its center was large enough to ensnare a person. Lisa recoiled. "What the hell is this?" "A trap," Alex said grimly. "Whoever's out here set it. They're trying to hurt us." Ryan crouched to inspect the snare, his jaw tightening. "This isn't random. They knew we'd come this way." "We need to keep moving," Alex said, his voice low. "Stay close and watch where you step." The traps became more frequent as they pressed on. Some were obvious, like the snares strung across the trail, while others were more insidious. A false patch of ground nearly swallowed Lisa when she stepped on it, revealing a pit lined with sharpened stakes. Ryan barely managed to pull her back in time, his grip tight on her arm as she teetered on the edge. "Jesus Christ!" Lisa gasped, her heart pounding. "What kind of psycho does this?" "No normal person," Ryan replied grimly. Their nerves were fraying, the tension thick enough to cut. Each trap they encountered felt like another nail in their collective coffin, a message from the unseen hunters that escape was not an option. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, they stumbled upon something that made them stop in their tracks, a campsite. It was crude but functional, with a makeshift shelter of branches and tarps and a fire pit filled with cold ashes. Nearby, a pile of supplies was neatly stacked, cans of food, a coil of rope, and a hunting rifle resting against a tree. "Is it theirs?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who else would it belong to?" Ryan replied, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. He gripped his knife tighter. Alex moved cautiously toward the pile of supplies, his heart racing. Something about the sight felt wrong, like it had been left intentionally, a breadcrumb on a deadly trail. "We need that rifle," Ryan said, stepping forward. "Wait," Alex hissed, holding up a hand. It could be another trap. But Ryan ignored him, his desperation overriding caution. He reached for the rifle, and that's when the first shot rang out. The sound was deafening, shattering the forest's fragile silence. Ryan dove to the ground as the bullet tore through the air above him, embedding itself in a nearby tree. The others screamed, scrambling for cover as another shot followed, then another. "They're shooting at us," Lisa shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "Get down!" Alex yelled, dragging Sarah behind a fallen log. His mind raced as he tried to figure out their next move. The shots were coming from somewhere in the trees, but the dense foliage made it impossible to pinpoint the source. Ryan, still lying prone on the ground, crawled toward the rifle. Another shot grazed the dirt inches from his hand, but he didn't stop. With a final lunge, he grabbed the weapon and rolled behind the makeshift shelter. "I've got it," he called, his voice hoarse. "Do you know how to use it?" Alex shouted back. "Better than whoever's out there," Ryan replied, cocking the rifle. He peered over the edge of the shelter, his eyes scanning the trees. "Show yourself, you coward!" The forest responded with silence. For what felt like an eternity, the group stayed hidden, their breath shallow and their bodies tense. The sun continued its descent, the shadows growing longer and darker. Just as they began to think the gunfire had stopped for good, a new sound reached their ears, a low, guttural laugh. It echoed through the trees, impossible to pinpoint, sending chills down their spines. "They're toying with us," Lisa whispered, her face pale. "This isn't just hunting. They're enjoying this." Ryan gritted his teeth, gripping the rifle tightly. "Let them come. I'll put an end to this." But as the laughter faded, it was replaced by an even more chilling sound. The snap of branches, the unmistakable crunch of approaching footsteps. "They're coming," Sarah whispered, clutching Alex's arm. And this time, they weren't running away. The crunching of footsteps drew closer, each sound calculated and deliberate. The group huddled in their makeshift cover, the fading daylight casting jagged shadows across their terrified faces. The tension in the air was suffocating, every nerve in their bodies screaming to run. Yet they remained frozen, paralyzed by fear of the unknown. Ryan gripped the hunting rifle tightly, his knuckles white as he trained the barrel toward the sound. "Stay quiet," he hissed, his voice a razor-thin whisper. His heart pounded against his ribs, the adrenaline sharpening his senses. The footsteps stopped abruptly. For a moment, the forest was deathly silent. Then, a low voice rang out, deep and mocking. "You can't hide forever." It was a man's voice, rough and gravelly, echoing unervingly through the trees. Lisa's breath hitched. "They're close," she whispered, clutching the cast-iron skillet like a lifeline. Ryan scanned the tree lean, his finger hovering over the trigger. The voice called out again, closer this time. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Ryan couldn't take it anymore. He stood abruptly, raising the rifle to his shoulder and shouting into the forest, "Come out, you coward!" The response was immediate. A sudden burst of movement to the left, accompanied by the unmistakable snap of a branch. Ryan swung the rifle toward the sound, firing a shot that echoed through the woods like a cannon. The others flinched, their ears ringing from the blast. "Did you get them?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. Ryan didn't answer. He squinted into the shadows, his breathing ragged. The forest remained still, as though it had absorbed the shot without consequence. "No way I missed," Ryan muttered. Suddenly, another voice rang out, this one from the opposite direction. "Missed by a mile." Panic erupted as the group realized they were surrounded. Alex grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back behind the fallen log. Emma crouched beside Lisa, both of them clutching their improvised weapons with shaking hands. "They're playing with us," Alex whispered, his face pale, "trying to make us panic." "Well, it's working," Lisa shot back, her voice trembling with anger and fear. Ryan fired another shot into the darkness, his frustration boiling over. "Come out and face us, you bastards." This time, there was no reply, only the sound of retreating footsteps. Ryan lowered the rifle slightly, his chest heaving. "They're backing off," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. "Or regrouping," Lisa muttered. "We need to move," Alex said urgently. "We can't stay here. They know exactly where we are." Ryan hesitated, his grip on the rifle tightening. "If we run, they'll pick us off one by one. They'll do that anyway if we stay." Alex snapped. "Guys," Sarah interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. She was staring at the ground, her face pale. "Well, what is that?" The group followed her gaze and saw what she was pointing at, an object half buried in the dirt near the base of a tree. Alex moved closer, his heart sinking as he realized what it was. A bloodstained jacket. It was Ben's. The bright red fabric was unmistakable, though it was now torn and smeared with mud and dried blood. Alex knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he picked it up. "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." Ryan looked away, his jaw clenched. Lisa swore under her breath, tears streaming down her face. "We don't know what this means," Emma said, though her voice was hollow. He could still be alive." Alex stood, holding the jacket tightly. "We have to go. Now." "What if they left this here on purpose?" Lisa asked. "To lure us deeper into the woods?" "Then it's working," Alex replied. "Because I'm not leaving him." The group pressed on, their fear driving them forward. The sun had set completely now, plunging the forest into darkness. Flashlights flickered in the gloom, their beams weak and inadequate against the vast expanse of shadow. The traps continued to appear, growing more elaborate and deadly. One nearly took Alex's leg, a tripwire strung between two trees that triggered a makeshift spike trap. He only narrowly avoided it, falling backward with a gasp as the spikes slammed into the ground inches from his feet. "This isn't hunting," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "This is war. Then we fight," Ryan said through gritted teeth, raising the rifle. As they moved, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Footsteps crunching through leaves, the faint murmur of voices just out of reach. Whoever was hunting them was no longer bothering to hide their presence. The group stumbled into another clearing, their exhaustion evident in every movement. Alex scanned the area, his flashlight beam catching on something that made his blood run cold. At the center of the clearing was a crude totem, a wooden post adorned with strips of clothing, animal bones, and tufts of hair. The ground around it was littered with blood-stained tools, knives, hammers, and saws, all coated in rust and dried gore. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, covering her mouth. Lisa turned away, retching into the bushes. "They're sick," Ryan said, his voice low and furious. "We have to stop them." Before anyone could respond, the laughter started again. This time, it came from all sides, surrounding them like a suffocating fog. The group spun in circles, their flashlights darting wildly through the darkness, but there was nothing to see, only shadows and the echo of their tormentors. "Stay together," Alex shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound. The laughter grew louder, closer. Then, from the edge of the clearing, figures emerged, 3 of them, each dressed in ragged clothing and masks made of animal skulls. They moved slowly, deliberately, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. Ryan raised the rifle, his hands shaking. "Get back," he shouted. The figures didn't stop. "Ryan, don't," Alex warned. Ryan fired. The recoil jolted him backward, but the shot hit its mark. One of the figures collapsed, blood pooling beneath them. The remaining 2 broke into a run. Chaos erupted as the group scattered, their instincts overriding any sense of strategy. Ryan stayed behind, firing another shot that missed its target. Lisa and Emma sprinted into the trees, their screams lost in the chaos. Alex grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the opposite edge of the clearing. "This way," he shouted, though he wasn't sure where they were going. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, branches snapping, heavy footsteps pounding against the ground. "They're coming," Sarah cried. Alex turned, his flashlight catching a glimpse of their pursuers. 2 figures closing the distance, their weapons raised. "Run!" Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.